Well, hello, everyone. Thank you, IOSG, for having us. We have a very exciting panel of guests today here to talk about layer 2 scaling solutions. I'm Ben, I work at Optimism, and we have some lovely other teams here who I'm going to ask to introduce themselves. So why don't we start with, I put together an alphabetical order list, so we'll start with Arbitrum.
Awesome, thank you. And yeah, thanks for having us. So I'm Harry. I'm one of the co-founders and the CTO of Arbitrum. We are building an optimistic rollup. We've been on mainnet for a number of months now. I think we'll get into a lot of the details of how it works over the panel, but try it today.
All right, Aztec.
Awesome. Hey there. Yeah, I'm Zach. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Aztec. We are a privacy-focused layer 2 for Ethereum. We focus on enabling both scaling and scaling transactions and making them private from observers. And we use zero-knowledge proof, ZK Smart Tech, to do this, including a proving system called Flonk, which we put together explicitly for this purpose.
Right on. All right. And Metalabs.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alex. I'm CEO and co-founder of Metalabs, the company behind ZK Sync protocol, which is a ZK rollup. We're live on Ethereum with transfers and swaps and NFTs for over a year now, and currently we are working on releasing the testnet for the first EVM compatible ZK rollup.
Right on, welcome. All right, and StarkWare.
Hi everyone, I'm Avihu. I'm head of product at StarkWare. Yeah, I'll be talking today mainly on StarkNet, our ZK rollup that is now on its alpha version on mainnet since I think about a week. Yeah.
Congratulations on that.
Welcome. Yeah, for real.
Thank you.
Right on. Okay, I guess I cheated and went first a little bit, but I'm Ben from Optimism. We're also building an optimistic rollup called Optimistic Ethereum. And we're super excited about it. We've been on mainnet for coming up on a year now, which is pretty crazy. And we just had our biggest upgrade to date, which we were very, very excited about. EVM equivalence, one-click deploy, baby. Okay, so I thought we could kick off this panel by asking one thing from each of you that you think is very awesome about your project, but you don't think enough people are aware of. It's a spicy problem, but I want to get this panel spicy, y'all.
The people aren't aware of part is definitely by far is the
Okay, how about this question? What do you think is undervalued in the public eye in comparison to how you view it?
I'll go with the first version of the question. I think I like it better. So I think two things that are quite surprising for everyone is the involvement of the community in even in the early version of StarkNet. So I see it in two aspects. One is how many people are interested to join Discord and do stuff for the project, create their own content that then everyone else are using, and it's happening like real quick before you could even. I think that's something that is like very undervalued or unknown how large this part is in StarkNet. And the other aspect that I see it in is we have a very new StarkNet Shamans, which is like kind of the same platform that you know and like from Ethereum research, ETH research, and then ETH magicians. So we run this experiment of like, let's bring open research question to the community and see if there is any interest to jump in. And I think there is, and it's pretty crazy to me. And I don't think that many people they have it in mind that, hey, I can just jump in and join and take like part in like the most critical decisions of the building a network.
Cool. I have a decent one. I'll go with kind of the interesting thing about open contract deployment is that basically a lot of the focus and a lot of the thought goes into sort of like where the like already well-known applications are going, which is obviously hugely important since they have kind of attention and traction. But kind of the coolest thing to me is sort of the long tail of weirdness of like, you know, having a system where like I get like surprised, like, oh wow, I had no idea it was being used for this, which is kind of a you know, a longer term organic thing than sort of like, you know, than sort of big names, but is sort of, you know, very valuable for kind of, you know, developing an ecosystem.
Yeah, I can jump in too, particularly on some of that long tail stuff. I guess one of the things we're really happy about with our tech that's maybe not as widely known yet is the level of kind of user interactability in our tech platform, particularly the work that we are planning on launching in the new year, which is why it's not that widely known. Something we're calling Aztec Connect, particularly right now with Aztec, you can shield and unshield and privately transfer ETH and other crypto assets. But the kind of the interface, the way of interacting is very much kind of like fixed. And with Aztec Connect, we're enabling private interactions with existing public layer 1 smart contracts and DeFi protocols without having to migrate or port them to the layer 2. And particularly anybody who's literate in Solidity programming can write a bridge contract, which kind of acts as the translation service between the Aztec network and layer 1 contracts and enable users to interact privately with L1 where like their identities are hidden, and it allows users to kind of enjoy the benefits of a layer 2 whilst not having to suffer from fragmented liquidity. But also on the topic of that long tail stuff, it allows for some new and innovative stuff that can't yet really happen on Ethereum. For example, it allows for things like blind auctions or anonymous voting, which is yeah, we're pretty excited about some of these prospects, and we already have some people from the community tinkering around with these applications.
Ooh, okay, I want to follow up. So is this the kind of thing where like I can be sitting in an Aztec pool and basically like batch along with a bunch of other private users, and then we'll like do a Uniswap trade to L1?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So it's I think sometimes it's called like DeFi pooling or DeFi aggregation, and yeah, it works for fungible assets, and at the moment like only fungible assets. Where yeah, it's what you said. If you and a bunch of other users want to do the same kind of interaction, like do a Uniswap trade or deposit into a liquidity pool, then yeah, we use ZK Snarks and our layer 2 to aggregate all these transactions together, and what gets sent to layer 1 is just one meta transaction that represents the batch. And that means the costs of the transaction is shared across all the users. And because of the awesome powers of zero-knowledge proofs, the identities of everyone are hidden. So you get privacy on top.
That's pretty sweet. I've heard of that design before, but I've never heard it done anonymously. That's very cool.
Thanks.
How about you, Alex?
I'm the only one left. So yeah, I was thinking what would be the most underappreciated aspect, which is hard because you have to like gauge the audience awareness. So like I was like a year ago, I would say it's that we are building an EVM compatible ZK rollup, but it's by now probably very broadly known. Then I would think about ZK Porter, like this hybrid solution with on-chain data availability, off-chain data availability, and that you can actually have seamless interaction between them within the same state. So some users can enjoy the one part, the others. So some users can enjoy the security of ZK rollup. The others can enjoy the cheapness of ZK Porter, but they're still interacting in the same system. But I think this is also broadly known. So I think the most underappreciated aspect of ZK Sync is our consistent, our focus on the end mission. Our commitment to the principles on which we build these decentralized systems, and which we try to make them resilient and unstoppable from the beginning. So when we launched ZK-Sync 1.5 years ago, it was an experimental project. So like it would be totally acceptable for us to just do it fully upgradable and like play around. But we decided not to go that path. We made it upgradable with a notice period from day one, taking the risks that like there might be some bugs and they might be exploited, and we won't be able to do anything like because we will have this 2 weeks of delay. But we wanted to signal to the community that like we're taking the decentralization as seriously, like even at the risk of this potential attacks, right? And the risks of those attacks are actually higher than the risks that like that we would be compromised or we would become malicious and like try to pull the rug. But we did it nonetheless, and we're gonna stick to this principle also in version 2. We're only gonna launch the version 2 once you have a fully trustless escape hatch on mainnet, where you can be sure that you can access your funds no matter what happens, even like if Metalabs disappears, or if we become malicious, or if we get forced by some like the state authorities to do something and like manipulate the data, you will be able to exit. Like now we introduced this idea of a security council. So we as a company cannot do an upgrade instantly. We will always initiate an upgrade and the users will have a few weeks of notice. We changed this approach now because there are a lot of funds at stake. We introduced a security council with a lot of prominent community members who act as a multi-sig. Like we can do an immediate upgrade if all of them agree. But this is like an ultimate defense. You need a lot of those people. But like we as a company cannot proceed instantly. And like you will always have this escape mechanism.
Nice, that's pretty cool. Okay, so I've been put in an interesting position here where I'm simultaneously hosting this panel and representing Optimism. I'll take a moment to give my answer. Something that I'm extremely excited about that I'm not sure if people are so aware of is that there are now three Optimism forks. If you go to L2Beat, that are all live. This is something that we are very proud of. Everything that we do is open source, MIT licensed, and like when we see other people deploying the stuff that we do, that's pretty darn awesome. So that was going to be my answer. Okay, cool. So the next juicy topic that I have for us all, I titled Big Blocker L1s. So I'm really honored to be sitting among a bunch of people building Ethereum scaling solutions. But believe it or not, there are scaling solutions out there that are not Ethereum or not using Ethereum. And so I'm really curious on what your guys' perspective on these are, because I think projects like Solana and Avalanche have been definitely picking up traction and steam as this year has gone underway. So I'd be really interested in hearing from you guys what your perspective is on these different L1s. Do you think that they have a role? If so, what are they? How would you summarize, sort of what they're doing?
I mean, I can kick off, I guess. Yeah, I mean, it's cool to see there's been an explosion of layer ones lately that that are attempting to solve the scaling issue via other means, like via different consensus mechanisms, different protocol architectures. And I think this is all uniformly positive for the entire blockchain space, right? Because I mean, Ethereum doesn't have a kind of a natural born right to be the canonical blockchain of choice, right? That's something that's earned. And having more layer ones out there, trying and experimenting with different architectures, it's a melting pot of ideas. And like in the long run, right, the whole ecosystem is going to benefit from this. And so yeah, I think it's broadly positive. I don't really see alternative layer ones and layer twos really being kind of in competition to each other. I feel like all layer ones are eventually going to use layer two based scaling solutions to scale, because the kind of the asymptotics of it are just not comparable. As in, like you've used zero knowledge proofs or optimistic rollups, you can scale a throughput of a network in theory by like 100, 1,000, 10,000x, which you can't do by tweaking with the consensus mechanisms, what's maintaining a high degree of security. So I see them as largely complementary, and I imagine that later on down the line they're gonna pretty much meld into such that like all layer ones will be using layer 2 tech as well.
I think there is some difference in at least in Solana's point of view. I don't know to say much about Avalanche, but I think from Solana's perspective, the good thing about what they did, and I appreciate it very much, is that they did manage to get a fairly nice parallel execution for transactions, which is something useful in many other cases, including in sequencing layer 2 transactions. So it's something very useful, and I guess that we'll see all kind of variations of it raising in our systems as well. But I think the main point where things are different is how important everyone see the ability of many users in the ecosystem to verify parts of the state by themselves, so to verify execution, and not a small set of validators that will do all that for you. And this ability is like, is this important? Is it important to have the ability for everyone that wish to verify everything in an inexpensive manner? The answer to this question is different between, let's say, Solana and Ethereum layer 2s.
Just to double down there, because I totally like the innovation going on at the execution layer is very cool to see. It's an area that kind of the EVM is great, but it's horrible. I think anybody who's working on EVM related stuff can relate to that. I mean, it's massively important, but it's also has a lot of technical debt and a lot of inefficiencies and a lot of, so kind of seeing other projects, I think Solana is a good example. They are really kind of pushing on kind of the execution space is pretty cool. I mean, this is kind of, we get, when you talk about other blockchains, there's also sort of, areas like Avalanche, it seems like kind of it's primarily has done like a huge amount of the consensus layer, having kind of a fundamentally, pretty different consensus mechanism, but kind of their, as far as I recall, like kind of their main contract chain is an EVM chain, as opposed to Solana, which is doing sort of less on the consensus layer, but is doing kind of a lot on the execution layer. This, we start drifting towards the, one of my favorite recent buzzwords, modular blockchains, and can kind of talk about like, at different parts of alternative L1s, kind of what they're doing, which is interesting, since I think there's a lot of sort of opportunity for mixing and matching of cool ideas.
Yeah, I fully agree to that. It's indeed really interesting on the research side. I'm not going to repeat on the parallel execution. It's just a question of what the purpose of blockchain is, and we're in this regard, zkSync is completely in the camp of Ethereum philosophy maximalists, and Ethereum places decentralization above everything else. Decentralization, security, resilience against very powerful attackers. And it's clear that if you don't prioritize this aspect, then you're going to lose it, because it's inevitable that you're going to make trade-offs. Like because it costs, it bears some significant costs to prioritize this aspect and to place a lot of emphasis on decentralization. So in my opinion, only the L1s that follow this philosophy will stay long-term, broadly embraced by the community, and the rest will be just experimental. So if the big chains that manage to innovate on the execution layer, on other aspects, will eventually embrace this philosophy and will be decentralized, we will be really happy to support them. But otherwise, I just don't see a point. Like it defeats the purpose of a blockchain.
You guys think there's anything to be said about decentralization in terms of user bases. Like, I feel like we're all kind of sitting here working on different projects that solve this problem of gas fees are too high and this drives users away. Do you think there's anything to be said about the fact that these sort of more centralized projects at least give some class of users access that couldn't otherwise be had? How do you guys think about that?
I think it's an excellent point.
Yeah.
I think
that's definitely what I struggle with as well. Is like these projects are clearly doing things that are like violating some of the decentralization principles that I like, to Alex's point, that we've got to be Ethereum to the core and stand for them. On the other hand, you see like people getting driven out of the market. And so I don't know. I think it's a very interesting catch 22. I think it's a challenging, a challenging space for us to think about.
Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting. There's like, there's also, I mean, the separation between like kind of, there's even sort of, stuff as simple as kind of market positioning for like, is someone think of themselves as an Ethereum killer, or does somebody think of themselves as kind of a side chain, essentially as kind of a service that is, mainly targeted at Ethereum users, and kind of how generally do they position themselves? I mean, one nice, I mean, certainly kind of we're heading into a nice world where rollups can provide, where L2 scaling solutions can provide like a range of security models with a range of costs. Like I think, Alex was talking about this with ZK Porter, obviously, like that provides like a similar nice trade-off space of security versus cost, and kind of continue, the having options on that spectrum is pretty nice. I think, the criticism of kind of blockchains as like not accessible by most people is one that I definitely forget about, like sometimes when I'm just like interacting with Ethereum, like how absurd it is, how expensive it can be, but it's very real. It's yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Go ahead, Zach.
I was just going to say, I mean, just as something small. I mean, I agree completely. I think the infancy of the technology is clouding what's happened. Like clouded, like is clouding this a little bit. But I think what's obviously going to happen through solutions like this is people are going to get the security that they're willing to pay for. Like Ethereum has is when it comes to decentralization security, it's like pretty much like as good as you can get. You need to be like a state level actor to compromise the security of the chain. But if you're just doing like payments worth a cent, or you're trading around tokens for a video game that are worth like next to nothing, other than like sentimental value, right? Like you don't really need the security of Ethereum. At least it's not worth paying for at the current gas fees. And so yeah, what's the difficulty right now is that if you want to adjust your, like if you want to pay less and get a different security model, that means moving to a different chain. It means changing the execution layer, which adds friction, which makes this all like a bit of a mess. But longer term, yeah, I think it's particularly by things like by being able to choose the source of your data availability, which has a direct effect on your security of the system. I think yeah, users will get the security that they're willing to pay for, and that'll. So generally, yeah, I think that the cheap chains are good for community engagement. They're good for getting people into this ecosystem. They're good for getting people to experiment with this tech, and eventually, yeah, it'll be a more. I think we'll have more market-based approaches to paying.
So I want to take a contrarian take on this particular point. Like I like to take contrarian takes, and say that like this sounds absolutely correct. I mean, it makes perfect sense, but I see the tail risk of this development. Like if you like you lure users with low fees, and like, oh look, you don't have to care about decentralization. Then you have more users, then you have some social proof, then you have a lot of capital locked in this chain, and then people start to put more money in it, and so like eventually you can end up with a black swan, like what happened to Mt. Gox, or worse, what happened to the internet, like, or what happened to the operation system race, where Microsoft took all of the users luring them with some like cheap properties, whatever, and then locking them in, or like Google and Apple just getting all the users into their apps, being monopolists now and being able to set like arbitrary exorbitant prices for developers, or like exclude certain apps from the community and so on and so on. Like we want to avoid those situations in the Web3. We have to learn from what happened to the internet. The internet was conceived as a decentralized network of networks where it was supposed to be peer-to-peer, and it ended up owned by a few corporations, very centralized, very tightly cooperating in a cartel-like structure where they can impose arbitrary rules, right? Just like getting users with the free product, because if the product is free, you know who is the product. So I'm really skeptical about that. Like I would rather have people like join Polygon or like other solutions that explicitly align themselves with the goals of Ethereum, with the goals of decentralization. Like it's not about Ethereum, it's not about tribalism in the name of Vitalik, or like some weird like maximizing your bets. It's about the philosophy. It just so happens that Ethereum has the superior philosophy today across like the chains I see, because it values these principles. Maybe Bitcoin is even more superior, but like you just like, if you don't innovate at all, that's a different story, right? But like on Ethereum you can innovate, and you have rollups, you have the side chains, like you can perfectly use them if you want to neglect security for a short time.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think this is the dynamic that keeps me up at night and like keeps me building, right? Is basically that, yes, in the long run, there should be a large trade-off space and you should be able to pay for your security. But at what time period do users come to understand the importance of that? And how does that go down in practice? Because to your point, there's definitely a world where you get hooked on the cheap transactions for your games, and then more and more transactions start routing through that. And it's much more convenient because you don't have to bridge anywhere else, right? So yeah, this is something that I struggle with too. I think we gotta keep it all up here, y'all. Keep those Ethereum vibes alive.
Yeah, those are like, that's a really valid point. The ideal world can get kind of corrupted by to the point where like these network effects mean that actually, whilst decentralized networks exist, they're not really being utilized. I think one of the differences between the internet and today is there are going to be viable alternatives. I think one of the problems with the internet was then the idea, like how do websites monetize? Well, they make you the product, not the customer. But there wasn't really a great alternative revenue model for the internet back in the day or now. And that's one thing that blockchains are going to change, hopefully, through extremely cheap payments and microtransactions. It means that actually users can take a bit more control over their data. But really, it's up to us to make sure that the fully decentralized solution is compelling enough that users don't just flock to the cheap chains with terrible security that some of whom like actively mislead users about the security of their networks. That's going to happen if Ethereum and other maximally decentralized networks can't properly scale and address the needs of their users, which also keeps me up at night.
It's definitely one of the areas that I've become less optimistic about over time in the space, is like is the ability to educate users about complex trade-off spaces. So I definitely, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of complex information and people are very busy. So, less like, not the people who are taking the time to listen to this panel, but like all of the people who are not attending blockchain events and listening to panels from Rollup projects speaking.
Hey, I'm curious, what has caused that shift in your mind? Has it been these ETH killers? Has it been other things? I
mean, it's a combination. It's definitely related. It's definitely the ETH killers are some of it, but sort of just the I've had a few too many conversations of people's eyes kind of glazing over as I try to describe the trade-offs between between different solutions. I think it's it's tough because, you know, all of us are, you know, obviously like very in it for the tech, you know, and not just the tech, but like, you know, the tech is certainly sort of a big part of it. But there's all sorts of other reasons why people come to the blockchain space. And, you know, a lot of, you know, some of those reasons don't, you know, create a huge interest in understanding the you know, fine-grained details of how things work. And this stuff is complicated. This stuff is like, you know, it's easy to forget how just like, you know, down the rabbit hole all of us are.
That's true. That's true. Cool. Okay, speaking of complicated, I feel like we would be remiss if we spent the entire time talking just about these ETH killers and all that. Let's talk about some like.
Yeah, but it's
some
fun, you know
deeper-
that.
Oh, it is. And I think like I wanted to make this panel as interesting as possible. And I think this is one of the things that should be on all of our minds right now. Like I do really view it as the responsibility of the group here and others to like keep those principles alive. Because to Harry's point,
Right.
you know, it's tough to do. Okay, but let's talk
We
about
also need to make sure that Harry is not getting too much tired of running this explanation to everyone. That's part of this
Right.
panel.
Right. Okay, so I want to talk about bridges, because speaking of complexity, right, we have everyone here on this panel creating one or in many cases multiple chains that are going to be or are already out there in the world. And one of the things that you have to do to use different chains is you have to bridge assets between them. So I'm really, and I think, at least speaking from Optimism's perspective, I know that we have kind of seen over the past few months a lot more bridges getting deployed onto our system. And so like, this is in some ways, it's almost something that I wouldn't have been thinking about like a year ago, right? Because in some sense, the whole point of a rollup is to create a like secure bridge, right? Like that's sort of the point, like the whole point of this challenge, fraud-proof mechanism, right, is effectively to enable a light client, which is a bridge. So I'm really curious. Yeah, I have some thoughts on this, but I'm really curious to hear you guys. Like, are there lots of bridges coming to your projects? I think this is an interesting question for the ZK or succinct proof people as well, because then the answer might be a little bit different for rollups. So are there more bridges coming? What does like a bridge ecosystem look like in a year? And how are these different bridges working?
Yeah, so we definitely have a lot of interest.
Great. Yes, I was gonna prompt the ZKP folks first because I understand less about bridging in the ZK world. Sure.
So the bridge ecosystem is flourishing. We see a lot of bridges being built. We see some bridges already getting into production. And for ZK, it's still like our focus is on security and trustlessness, and we want to leverage that to the maximum. And with ZK, it's really easy to have like to pass the final state from one ZK rollup to another within a very short period of time. So I don't want to make exact predictions on how the world will look like, because we'll see a lot of innovation coming to the space, which is like which is going beyond my imagination. But I think we will have like lightweight solutions where you can like quickly send some funds in a trusted way, and you will have like a more sophisticated machineries for bridging assets of very high value between different rollups in a very robust way.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to follow on from that, yeah, pretty much hit the nail on the head there from what I was going to say. Yeah, zero-knowledge proofs add like just to might be a bit of repetition, but one of the awesome things about zero-knowledge proofs is because you can, in theory, succinctly, quickly verify the correctness of an entirely different chain. It does, in theory, open up the possibility to do completely trustless swaps between two chains, as long as you trust the consensus mechanisms of the respective chains. I think we're a little ways off from that actually happening, just because all these chains have different architectures, different interfaces, connecting it all is a lot of work, which is why I think it's important for, well, I mean, the long-term goal, right, is for all of these systems to be completely decentralized and composable. So with Aztec, it's going to take a little bit longer, just because we use we add privacy into the mix, which means that making programmable private smart contracts is something that we're targeting in about 12 months from now. It's not, but once you have composability right, the community can build their own bridges. You get this crucible of innovation, and we're seeing that happening on other layer twos. And so I feel like the bridge issue is going to be solved through by the community because these networks are maximally decentralized and because they're based around composability. That being said, I think that it's going to become bridges between layer twos are going to be a big deal, just because people are going to want to use different layer twos. They'll have different projects involved. They might have different trade-offs, different features like privacy, for example. And you don't want to go through a layer one like Ethereum to transfer between two layer twos, because then you have an extremely expensive transaction in your hands. And yeah, in the early days, I think most bridges are going to be fairly trusted. But yeah, I'm very excited about the long tail future where you have fully trustless swaps based around zero knowledge proofs.
There's two kind of relatively interesting things I think I could say about bridging. I certainly agree with all of this, and for obviously bridging is quite important to optimistic rollups because of the withdrawal delay, But so I think, two at least relatively interesting points to make. One is that one of the nice things about bridges from a security perspective is that most of the risk is on liquidity providers rather than users. Not all of it, but essentially for users, if you're swapping, you put your funds in, you get funds out quite quickly. You're not leaving funds in control of somebody. The worst case scenario is not good, which is your funds disappear, but essentially the risk is much higher to liquidity providers in those bridges. And those are the people who can actually do the technical due diligence to make sure they're comfortable with it. So that's one thing that's nice. So not that bridges are inherently safe, but at least there's a strict limit to how much you need to trust them. The other is that one of the very interesting things I found is that at least the liquidity-based bridges try to keep funds across chains that they're bridging in balance, which means that they actually can incentivize, they can actually make cheap things even cheaper. So for example, depositing into an optimistic rollup, which there is no delay, you still may want to go across a bridge because it might be valuable to that bridge to rebalance assets from Ethereum onto the rollup. So kind of even if you're not saving time, you could save money by using one of these protocols.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the visions that we had early on in the Plasma days even was there was all this talk about fast exits, right? The OG idea of a Plasma fast exit was you do this exit, there's a pending withdrawal, and you get an NFT, and you can sell that NFT and get your funds out, right? And it's really been interesting to see that massively evolve. As this kept progressing, where we moved to was, okay, maybe it's not an NFT that you're selling, but it is sort of an order that somebody else can fill by sending you money on L1. And then that was how we thought about it. And then we kept thinking about it more, and we realized, wait, this basically means that in the steady state of a rollup, maybe it's the case that nobody is ever depositing and withdrawing, because if the demand for moving funds into the rollup and the demand for moving funds out of the rollup is the same, then they should just be trading those assets all the time, right? And so we had this weird realization, oh, maybe we're not going to see any use of the native bridging at all, and it's all just going to be these swaps. And I think, to your point, Harry, the sort of market-based mechanics for liquidity now are basically showing that, where, okay, we don't get that perfect equilibrium, we're not there, but there is a market that is basically incentivizing arbitrage to produce that equilibrium or try to approximate it. And I totally agree with you as well that that taxonomy of security for the users is at least only at risk when funds are in transit is definitely good. It's definitely, I agree that it's good. It's interesting. Honestly, there's a funny parallel here between the previous stuff about people not understanding decentralization and being worried about it. One of the things that scares me is that so there are classes of bridges, right, where users are completely collateralized, and so it is trustless, right? Like in the worst case, the fast sort of action might not happen, and they have to wait for their slow path, withdrawal, but their money is guaranteed to be safe. And then there's these other classes which are less collateralized, but to your point, the funds are at risk, right? It's like if the bridge is hacked once a month, but it takes me 5 minutes to get my money across, that's honestly kind of good chances. So I think this is honestly a similar concern that we may have of like, oh shoot, people are going to start using these cheaper bridges because probably under collateralization is more economically efficient. But then what happens when the big, when the bridge breaks?
I also, if we're talking about bridging, I want to like harp on one of my favorite / least favorite targets, subjects, which is related, which is fractionalized asset representation, aka there's like 5 different, DAIs or USDCs on some chain, and they're non-fungible. That's kind of one of the biggest bridging, one of the biggest kind of dividers to me in terms of bridging is what is actually being bridged. I've seen a mix of both. I've seen some that sort of operate on top of the native bridge. I've seen some that kind of define their own representation of the asset in the layer 2, and kind of there's in some cases you have sort of a DApp that decides that like its primary representation of the token is not going to be the native bridged one. It's going to be the one that was bridged using an alternate bridge with a different representation. So this is kind of one of the issues I think that's going to be emerging over time and is going to be really tricky to deal with. It's I think kind of the primary reason why sort of native built-in bridges exist is to try to like not have this occur. Since we could have just not built bridges and had other people do it, but then the problem would be even worse. And so sort of figuring out how to minimize that as much as possible is going to be interesting.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, because also those projects which will choose to use the non-native representation, that statement that we made earlier about the security only being at risk while it's in transit is not true, right? Because the assumption you're making there is that the reason that the risk ends is because you trade it back out for the native asset. So if an app chooses to let a user leave it in the non-native asset, then you're actually now exposed to that risk for a much longer term. So that's an interesting note.
I know this happened on like XDAI as well. It's just it's impossible to completely avoid it.
Yeah, for sure. I remember seeing some wallet UX horror story tweets like a year ago or something that were all talking about this. Yeah, it's interesting. The ZK space seems to me like you guys, I think, have probably a little bit of an easier time at this. Right? This is just an intuition, right? I'm not as familiar with your guys' protocols as optimistic roles, but it seems like the fact that you have these validity proofs that are like being resolved in less than 7 days, it seems like you have an opportunity here to like keep the fungibility alive, so to speak. Do you guys think that's true?
I think that in any case, you will also have this problem of you don't maintain, at least at the beginning, some canonical bridge to layer 1, even if you submit proofs very frequently and you have finality really, really quick. If you get different bridges implementation that does different things on layer 1, then you can still get fragmentation and liquidity, right? Fragmentation on the same token. So at least at the beginning, you have to make sure that it's coming from the same source. After some time, you will anyway have the effect of everybody trusts whatever the maker bridge for DAI, and that's become the canonical bridge for maker, and then and so on. And also, I think that sure, faster finality is an advantage, and I think it makes the life easier for liquidity providers, and therefore you'd probably see lower fees on faster finality rollups. But on the other hand, we also want the better user experience of like almost instant transfers. So you'll see that emerging. You'll see the bridges ecosystem emerging also in ZK rollups. That's what I think.
Yeah, I think long term, there's always going to be some kind of fragmentation because it's in permissionless networks. You can't control people. You only incentivize them to in certain ways. So like the way it currently works in Aztec is that we have layer 1 smart contracts that act as custodian of your tokens while they're in the layer 2. And for a given token type, it's very important that everyone uses the same custodian contract, because if you don't, then you get fragmented liquidity, right? If you have 2 layer 1 smart contracts that represent, that hold DAI while it's in the Aztec network, then you have 2 different representations of DAI on the layer 2. I do think that users' incentives are relatively well aligned to use the same custodian contract. So I'm quite hopeful that the levels of fragmentation won't be severe, but we'll see how that plays out.
Wait until your users start depositing multiple versions of wrapped ETH as the next WETH comes out. Then you'll be in trouble.
Yeah, well, we can't help with layer 1 fragmentation. That's, if it's happening layer 1, then we just inherit those problems.
Touche. You're just inheriting L1. That's true. All right, guys, we're looking at like 9 minutes left. I had a generic question here on the UX for mass adoption. I feel like we talked about UX a little bit here. I'm wondering if in the last 9 minutes we don't just open up the floor. I'm curious what y'all might want to talk about, or Shill, what are you excited about in 2022? I feel like this is going to be a big year for layer 2, so I'm sure there's some opinions there. So yeah, I don't know.
I actually, yeah.
Left. Let's open up the floor.
I have a question to
Alex
everyone.
Is ready to go.
Yeah, that is, so we have a couple of problems with UX and security on layer 1, which we have a chance to address in layer 2 from get-go. And I'm curious what's your guys' take is on those. So one particular aspect is, or maybe it's interconnected, like different approach to dealing with native ETH and ERC20 tokens and the approvals in ERC20 tokens. Because like that's a massive problem now. We've seen last week a few people got hacked because the front ends of certain protocols were compromised, and they previously approved unlimited amount of tokens to those protocols, and like some weird things happen there. So like it would be much easier if you had a very clear policy on, like, whenever you interact with the contract, you just authorize exactly the number of tokens that you want to spend with this contract. And that requires changes in the approach. Like all the contracts that rely on ERC20 just do not work this way. So how do you think about this issue?
There's one nice thing that we had the opportunity to do, which is like a relatively small thing, but which we were really excited about, which was to set the standard for what the default kind of token would look like in L2. And one big thing we were able to do there is have permit included, which, I don't think we need to go into I think probably people here are generally familiar with that on the call, and I don't think we need to go into the exact details, but like, basically, have a better standard extended ERC20 that kind of dApps can just assume tokens implement, which, does not solve everything, but certainly at least improves the situation.
Yeah, I think that the challenge in that question, Alex, comes down to like, to some extent, what is the role of us as people building infrastructure that people are going to be building applications on top of, right? Like one of the biggest realizations for us this year has been that like the realization that there's an incredibly strong power to following the EVM like to the T, right? This is what we call like our EVM equivalence upgrade, is like following the EVM not just in a way that looks familiar to devs, but like literally does the exact same gas schedule for everything, has the exact same Geth code running behind it. And so to some extent, like that, I do feel like that philosophy is like counters our ability to, at least at a protocol level, make any decisions that are going to change this behavior, right? Because ultimately the approval behaviors that have come out are just a result of usage of the EVM. So to the extent that it's our responsibility to just build an EVM equivalent platform, somehow I feel like my hands are tied. I think that what we can do is try to provide leadership and like try to promote the right kinds of these things. And so I think maybe that just comes down to community. Like ultimately, it can't just be us building the infrastructure, but if we promote a community of security and try to develop around these new standards, it is true that there's a chance as these, nation networks start growing to get some of it right from the get-go. But I think that's as much about community as it is about our particular responsibilities as protocol developers.
Fully agreed.
Good point. I can have a stab at this as well. I think Aztec, we're in a bit of a semi-unique position where we have something which is both a combined problem and a opportunity. And that's because everything is by default private in Aztec. It means that we cannot conform to the interfaces or execution model of the EVM to the latter. Whilst that, one of the benefits of that, though, is that we have a chance to kind of re-architect things from the ground up, because we don't have this this pressure to conform to the EVM to ease adoption, because, well, you can't if it's private. So one thing we are going, like one thing in our, so for example, in our network, like Ether tokens are the same. They're not treated as different classes. You can pay for transactions in tokens if you want. For our composable programmable network, Aztec 3, that we're as under development, we will be representing ETH just as another kind of token. So you don't have these alternative transaction flows. And similarly, like we will almost certainly in the canonical asset contracts be using having a permit function, and also shield and unshield functions. Yeah, it's. I feel like for every problem we're going to solve, we're going to create another one, because yeah, composable privacy is not it's not really been done in a big way before. So there's probably going to be, for every issue we solve, we're going to create another one from the decisions we make. But we'll see. We'll find out.
Say it's hard to predict the future, basically.
Yeah, pretty much.
I guarantee that will always be true. Well, I will jump in here again. Actually, you did just remind me, Zach, of one other thing, which is WETH versus ETH, and ERC20 ETH versus native ETH. And this is something that you mentioned, Alex. I totally neglected to mention this, but I want to take a minute to shill people joining the discussion about how optimistic Ethereum should do this. In the OVM 1.0, we actually implemented it both ways. So if you deposited ETH in, the way that would work would be that you would receive an ETH balance that you could query with all of the native ETH opcodes, but it would also be the result of a balance of call to a standard ERC20 like contract. And so you actually had a WETH contract the result of the balance call was the same as your native balance, and you would pay ETH from that ERC20. We actually disabled that because when we went the EVM equivalence route, we realized that this is not equivalent to the EVM. So it may be something that people are a fan of, but we actually chose to disable it to keep things equivalent for now. So if you are a dev listening to this and you have strong opinions, because we have heard opinions both ways on this, go to our GitHub, github.com/Ethereum-optimism/optimism, and contribute to the discussion, because we want to know what you think we should do.
Like, oh, I have a good chill. Ethereum 2.0.
Now's the time.
Ethereum 2.0. I mean, I know this is an L2 panel, but I feel like it would be incomplete if we were not to shill the excitement of the upcoming merge, and then all of the many new funny namings that have been coined for the various roadmap components.
Oh yeah, the purge. I agree. ETH2 is going to be hype. ETH2 is going to scale us all. I guess even beyond that, is it 4488 that we should also probably?
Yeah, I was sure that someone will mention it. Thank you,
At
Ben.
some point, we should have a conversation about the effect of the ability of rollups to sync, and how data availability of past blocks will work for a freshly syncing rollup node under these new models.
Oh, that's interesting. Wow. Okay, that's a juicy one that we'll have to save for another panel, y'all. But that is making me think. Yeah, 4488 though, tell your friends. I think it will help everyone on this call to have larger blocks. I was going to say bigger blocks, but that's not really right, is it? Larger block sizes without that meaning gas. Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome stuff.
All right, guys. Well, I think that's a good time to stop as any. So I want to give you guys a sincere thanks for taking the time to sit down and chat and get into some real meat. I thought that was really fun.
Thanks for
Everyone,
Likewise.
thank you, Ben.
Thanks a
Yeah,
lot. It's
thanks
been
a
fun.
lot.
Guys.
It was a lot of fun.